Get going. Back to the Restaurant Technology Guys podcast. I thank everyone out there for joining us. It's a privilege to come on the air with you guys each and every week to share some cool restaurant tech news. Today is no different. And I want to introduce the world to somebody that I got introduced to by a good friend of mine who's been on the show as well, Tammy Billings. A lot of you guys will know Tammy. But Mike, why don't you go into a little bit about who Mike is, and then we can talk a little bit about what you get to do, because I'm excited for our audience to hear more about your latest venture.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, so I've been in restaurant technology for 25 years now. Before then, I was in restaurant operations before I went back to get my graduate degree. And I actually went back to grad school thinking I was going to go back into restaurant operations, maybe on a larger scale. But I got very interested in the quantitative side of things. And
Mhm.
when I got out, I got very focused on pricing and analytics and data. And this is going back years before really anybody was particularly interested in restaurant data. In fact, it was an odd concept at that point. Nobody was really pulling data out of point of sale. And I started working for really the first company that started analyzing data and building price elasticity, right, to understand how, when prices change, consumers change their behavior.
Mhm.
And at that point, we were just a very small group, and I was an early partner in that endeavor. And we got, I don't think it's necessarily luck, right? There's a little bit of luck and skill and success. And we had a good break and became the global pricing provider for McDonald's. So we went from a small outfit to a multinational in a hurry, and I ran the domestic business for about like 6 or 7 years there. And that taught me a lot about not just econometric modeling, but also how to build software and so on and so forth. And then I started my own company, some of it with pricing, but also promotional analytics and social media analytics. But really, the whole idea of how much data can you pack into different kinds of algorithms. That business I grew. Actually, I started that one during the depths of the financial collapse, which was, in some ways, I thought at the time, what a terrible time to start a business. But in retrospect, it was probably the best time I could imagine, because nobody was going to invest in you, right? So you had to bootstrap it
You had to
and
figure it
figure
out.
out exactly. So I became a very early adopter of the AWS cloud before anybody was really, even everybody thought I was absolutely nuts. But at that time, I could rent. It was before they even had persistent storage. So I was just renting a few hours in the afternoon to load data up and run crazy algorithms and then take it down. So I could run really elaborate algorithms for maybe a couple $1,000s in an afternoon. But instead of, at that time, back in 2008, to run a data business, you were buying a server farm, right?
Yeah,
And
you were
spending
building it all
millions of
yourself,
dollars.
and yeah, there wasn't the elasticity. I guess I know, Mike. You talk about your operations days. Talk to me about your latest venture, because I think back from being in operations, going to school, you got into tech, which is those are always my favorite people to talk to, because they understand what it looks like to be in a restaurant and deal with the guests and deal with all of the fun that goes along with that, and they're not just building models that are in a cloud somewhere that nobody's ever actually going to understand. That carried you through to the tech side. But I guess you've launched your latest endeavor. I'd love to hear what is that, and then we'll talk about what it does, because I think it's going to take a lot of that more than 20 years worth of experience that you've had over the last period and really helping brands out.
Yeah, no, this is by far, I think, my most exciting. I think largely because after all this time, you just start from a completely different place.
Hmm.
And some of it was some deep thinking and reinvention during COVID, because right before COVID, I had sold my last business, and then I had exited. I didn't realize the whole world was also exiting during COVID. And as the world started to come out of that period, all of the methods that you had to do that I've been using for decades require a certain stable period of demand.
Yes.
And that didn't exist anymore.
Yes.
But people were still coming to me and saying, "Can you still do something to help us
Yeah.
figure this
Yeah.
out?"
Day parts. I remember talking to operators, and they're like, I don't understand. My Tuesday afternoons are my busiest time. Those were my slowest times for the last 20 years. And now Tuesday afternoons, I get hit and Fridays are dead. during the COVID periods, to your point, and so it's
And
interesting.
and even afterward, right? Because then all of a sudden, even like people in their trade areas, right? So now people, are they working from home? Are they going into work? Did they move from packed cities into rural? So the way that people were navigating their trade areas, where they lived, everything was completely different. Even what units shuttered, what was opening, where
Hmm.
people, the digitization. So I had to really rethink everything about how we analyze things. Everything that I had built before was about how do you go to the point of directly to the point of sale, analyze the behavior of how people are purchasing things at the point of sale, and then from there you back into who the consumer is and where they're coming from and some trade area information and some economic data, and it worked. But now it doesn't, right?
Hmm.
Because you don't have that trending data. So I said, what if you change the methodologies, the statistical methodologies themselves, and you start with completely different data sets? I started pulling in mobile data sets, device data, where you actually know who's going into each restaurant, where they came in before. Um, a lot of restaurants are using that kind of data, but they're using it as an endpoint, right? I'm using it as an input, right,
Hmm.
to these models using credit card data. So I know, okay, they're spending this much money at my restaurant. How much are they spending when they're at other restaurants or when they're going to other retailers, right? Who are these people? What sort of economic situation are they in? What are the local economics like? 20 years ago, the the data that you could get of the local economy, whether it's local gas prices or things that are really affecting people's disposable income at a very local level, it just wasn't knowable. And now you can get all of this kind of information. So really, you start to really understand who's coming into each restaurant and what their spending power is. So I started building these models at first on a consulting basis, and then I started to see, look, as gas prices start to change and home heating oil starts to change and as inflation starts to go up, before I even get point of sale data from people, I can start to predict how different restaurants are going to, not just how price sensitive they're going to be, but start to really understand what the whole demand patterns are going to be for these restaurants. I was actually, what started off as a hypothesis, I was just shocked at how yeah, how robust these models started to become. So
I think that led you to your latest venture. So talk to me a little bit about, is that really the forming of the company? You were doing this work as a consultant. You said, this is really a product that I can turn around and put in the hands of restaurant brands to be able to make these decisions that you were doing in a, I say one off basis, but really to some specific end users that had engaged with you.
that's exactly right. Because in the past, the types of methodologies and the way that things were built, when you relied just on the point of sale data, you had to you had to depend on the brands themselves to have really clean point of sale data. You had to rely on them to give you all of the data first before you could tell them anything about their brand. So it really meant that you had to be a certain size chain
Yep.
with a certain level of sophistication before you could have any of these methods applied to you. So really what it did was it changed my ability to be able to take some of these methods that were really only available to the mega change for 20 years
Hmm.
and start applying them to smaller and smaller chains at really better prices with the same kind of rigor and scalably, right? Because what I was doing before didn't really have the kind of scalability, because you had to, every single restaurant is different and everybody's data is different. So yeah, so it was this moment of revelation that all of a sudden there's a new business in this.
And I think it's, I'm gonna make a couple of statements here, Mike, because I've been in the space for almost as long as you have. I've watched different brands guess at these pricing models, guess at the reasons why sales are up, guess at the reasons why sales are down. We've had quite a few companies on in the last year that have been doing market research data, really to understand their consumers but very few have gotten to the level of understanding how much price can change a behavior, how much price can change the behavior up, sales down. And the other piece I would say to you is oftentimes when I think about these things, it's a lot of people take it from a very mathematical perspective. They look at it and go, if I change the price by this and I sell the same amount, I'm going to make X amount more in profit, which is purely a math equation. And you being from a restaurant business, you realize that it just because I change price up or down, depending upon the nature of what's going on, it may change. So it's not always just pure math. Sometimes there's science, sometimes there's math, sometimes there's even emotion in it. Talk to me about how you think about that as you are very deep into the data and understanding how those things go.
I think you really hit it, right? Because you have to understand the data in context, and
Hmm.
you have to understand the math, and you have to understand at a really deep level what these different equations are actually doing, right? It's the day of the citizen data scientist, right?
Yes.
So anybody can download a price elasticity equation. Wonderful, right? So
Hmm.
I hear on the news people saying, "Oh, I have no price elasticity in my brand." And I'm like in tears, right? Because I'm going, "Oh boy, how did they even run this?" Because one of the problems right now is that, and look, I've been preaching right to the industry for decades
Sorry, that
that
was my fault. Go for it.
I've,
No, keep going.
so yeah, I've been preaching to the industry for decades that you really that they should be paying attention to price elasticity, and you should be measuring it.
Hmm.
But the trouble is, if you're not measuring these things the right way, then you could be getting a lot of false positives.
You talk about how elastic and people are can go download these elastic models, but ultimately they're not a linear equation. And I think oftentimes people see these things and just think it's straight linear, and it doesn't work that way. Ultimately, the data has proven out that it doesn't work that way. So talk to me a little bit about how you guys consider that.
Yeah, the restaurant industry is not like a lot of other industries, right? It's not a commodity, right? It's not the same thing as buying a stapler, right?
Yep.
When you go into an Office Depot and you buy a stapler and the price of the stapler changes, if it's too expensive, you put down the stapler and you don't buy it, right? If
Hmm.
it's out of your reach. In a restaurant, it doesn't work that way, right? You go into a restaurant, and if the price of a hamburger isn't reached a price where you're going to change your behavior, you don't just get out, leave the restaurant typically, right? Usually you're going to change something about your behavior in that moment. And it
Hmm.
might be not buying the beverage, right? Or you might
Hmm.
not buy the side, right? There's something about that in that moment that you might change, but you're not losing that traffic count, right? That comes later, right? So when you're measuring something in restaurants, you need to understand what's happening in different purchase cycles, right? And you need to understand that people are managing their basket in earlier purchase cycles, and then later on, you might be losing frequency, and then you may be losing the traffic altogether, right?
Hmm.
You also need to understand that because it's not a commodity, it's an emotional experience, right? Restaurants are one of the few call it products that actually appeals to all five senses, right? Think about it,
Okay.
right?
Didn't think about that, but yeah, you're right.
And if you are creating an experience, and look, I think the first time I saw one of these value equations where it says, okay, the value of an experience is a function of the total experience, right? The quality of the food and the service as a function of price. That sort of resonated with me. And I thought, if that's true, then you should be able to make a mathematical equation out of it over time and test it. And I got obsessed with this. Over 20 some years, every chance that I got to be able to put in, whether it's customer satisfaction or anything that could indicate whether the customers are happy or reacting to something in a later purchase cycle, I'm
Hmm.
putting that into the equation, not just did they change their behavior, right? And in one moment, right?
Yeah, and did sales go up or sales go down based on that? And I think that's one of the things that I think makes some of the stuff that talking to you pre-show, talking to Tammy a little bit about the product is you guys take a lot larger data sets, a lot more different areas that impact this cycle. And again, I attribute some of it back to the fact that it sounds like from a data science perspective, you're really good and understand data sets. And then tack on top of that, the fact that you came out of the restaurant space. Talk to me about the different because historically, again, if Steve's running a bar, Steve knows who's coming in, Steve knows who's leaving, Steve can change his price. But as you get to scale, it's impossible to do that once you get beyond one or two locations because Steve's bar, he knows who's coming in, who's not coming in. If he changes the price of Miller Lite, he knows, hey, Joe didn't come in anymore. You can't do that. You are capturing, you talked about it earlier, credit card spend, you talked about mobile data, you talked about pricing data. Talk to me about all of the different areas that you're able to capture that data because it doesn't sound like that was even possible 20 years ago to get all of that data and you guys continue to add on to it.
Yeah, no, you're right. It wasn't even possible 7 years ago, right? The data sets and even the methodologies, right? Being able to drill down and write and execute an algorithm that can really analyze the the depth of the purchase baskets to
Mhm.
pick up on these cues that customers are changing their behavior earlier in a purchase cycle. But you've got to start with understanding what the behavior of restaurant customers are. If you think that a lot of pricing theory in comes from airlines and hotels, but there's real problems with applying that to restaurants, right? Because those industries assume that there's a capacity problem,
Uh-huh.
and that when you manage that capacity that people are going to accept it. They don't account for the same emotional attachment that comes with restaurants.
Yeah. Yeah, and even the behavioral. One of the things as you were talking earlier, even that I found myself, and I'm sure all of us did, is we go to the same restaurants because they're part of our regular rhythm of life, our regular cycle of life. And when that cycle of life changes, our behaviors oftentimes change because of that. Sometimes it is driven by price changes and those kind of things. But in the middle of COVID, it's like, hey, I used to go to this restaurant every Thursday after soccer practice. Soccer practice isn't happening, so I'm not going to that restaurant anymore because COVID happened, and I'm not going to the office every day. So I'm no longer spending next to the office. But I think talk to me a little bit about that because you talk about this emotional and this linear equation even with hotels. Funny enough, I was looking at a hotel for right around a trade show, and I'm like, I don't know that I want to spend that kind of money based on that because the price has gone up in the area where this trade show is. 100% to what you said, I made a decision. Whereas if I was in a restaurant, I would have bought the combo or I would have bought it without the drink. Back to your point.
You said something really important in there, right? Which is we make certain restaurants a part of our lifestyle, right?
Mm,
You build in certain habits,
yep.
right? And it may be that I'm going to have lunch at noon every day, and then for a while my noon lunch was the same place all the time, and it just became easy, and that's what I was doing.
Hmm.
Part of the whole theory of like the dynamic pricing and what's adopted from the airlines and the hotels is I'm going to change your behavior because it's better for my restaurant to get you to come in at 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock. And there's some problems in that, which is, okay, I'm going to make you hungry at 11 o'clock for money.
Yeah, probably
All
not.
right, there's a problem first. But then there's a second problem, which is there's different, I've read a couple of versions of this, right? But it takes somewhere between 30 and 90 days to develop a habit. And once you've gotten a customer to develop a habit, do you really want them to break it? Because
Hmm.
once you get them to break that habit, that's a risk. You're risking them. And if you're going to get them to break that habit over price, is that really how you want them to break a habit of coming into your restaurant on a somewhat regular basis, right?
Yeah.
There's some problems in that, right? So anyway, I think point being that when you get really deep into pricing, right? And I think this is important, right? Is that pricing isn't the only thing that we do, but pricing is a really good foundation for a lot of what we do, because in order to do pricing the way that we do it, you really have to understand the foundation of the demand at a really local level, right? Because once you understand that, then you understand, then you can discern what's price, right, and what's promotion, and what's weather, right, and what's your competitor, right, that's pulling the demand away from you, right. And that's really what our goal is in bringing in all of these other data sets, right. So it requires us building really these foundational models that are understanding what's the demand that we expect each location to have, so that we can discern what's coming from price. And I think that's some of the problem, is that when I see restaurant companies during a highly inflationary period saying, we have no price elasticity, the definition of price elasticity is 1% increase in price is 1% decrease in traffic. You tell a restaurant executive that your 1% increase in price is going to result in a 1% decrease in traffic, or your 5% increase in price is going to
Impressive.
result
Yes.
in a 5%.
Uh,
That is an elastic condition. And anything
yes.
lower that is not elastic, right? So what level are they actually using? Because we're not using the textbook definition
Yeah.
because we know that's not acceptable, right, for this industry.
I'm certain we're going to get into this because this is one of the things that I actually laugh about because I think restaurant operators oftentimes, even if the data is right there in front of them, don't believe it or do it the way that they've always done it. We have a very famous national brand that their CEO, their founding CEO, does 100% of the price changes, and he does it based on gut feel, and I don't get it. And even if their group has proven to him statistically, and he doesn't care. He's going to do it the way he's going to do it based on what his own feeling is and what is somebody willing to pay for this dish versus that dish. And I think it's funny. You mentioned, Mike, that 7 years ago you couldn't even get a lot of this data. How are you guys storing this data? Talk to me a little bit because it's just more data is being produced. Anybody that's ever run a restaurant knows the craziness that happens during a meal period in a rush. One of our partners, Restaurant Technologies Total Oil Management Solution, is an end-to-end oil management system that delivers, filters, monitors, and recycles your cooking oil, taking one of the jobs that none of your team wants to do and takes it off your hands, allowing your team members to focus on their guest. Control the kitchen chaos with restaurant technologies and make your kitchen safer while maximizing your staff's time. The solution can be provided at no upfront cost. If you want to learn more, please check out rti-inc.com or call 888-796-4997. I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but I know more data is being produced now than ever, and it's only going to continue to expand. I heard something last week or 2 weeks ago where by 2050, 2055, we're going to run out of silicon, like in the world. By the end of within the next 100 years, we're going to run out of silicon to even be able to create the chips. And so people are trying to figure out better and smarter ways to store things. How are you guys doing that? You mentioned AWS earlier. I know there's lots of people that are dealing with this. Talk to me a little bit about the tech portion of it, because I think it's critical to understand as you guys continue to add data sets, what does it mean to both the results and how you guys get there?
Yeah, we our tech stack is a combination of AWS and Snowflake. And I was, as I said, I was an early adopter in the Amazon cloud, but I started using Snowflake, boy, I guess it's 7 years ago now.
Oh my gosh, you were an early adopter of Snowflake then too, because it's not been around that long.
It's been, I was pretty early. Yeah. It's been around longer than people know. It has
Mhm.
actually been around quite a while, but it didn't start getting popular until probably the last 4 or 5 years. But what they've done is it's very different because it's designed for people who are analyzing data, right? As opposed to people who are, maybe a lot of these databases are prime for people who are maybe building an app, right? Or
Mhm.
building an interface. And without getting too technical, right? It's a columnar database, right? There's this eternal headbutting that I got to do with for most of my career with the folks who always want to normalize the data sets, right? So you've got like lots and lots of tables. So all the sophistication that you've got to do is written in, pages and pages of code
Hmm.
that are joining the tables. In analytics, you don't want to do that, right? Because the sophistication that you're doing has to go into the mathematical code that you're doing,
Yep.
and you have to see the changes, right, in the tables in order to make sure that you're able to QA every single step. So in Snowflake, being able to do really wide tables with all of the data that you have
Hmm.
without and being able to have that with really cheap storage so that you can have really big tables with slowly changing dimensions completely changed the kind of work that I do. Trying to do that in Redshift 10 years ago, for
Well, you were writing a
I
lot more
tried.
code. You weren't able to. You were just having to write a ton more code. It was funny that you say that. I was talking to our CTO recently about the advent of all of these just different data sets and these machine learning logarithms. It's insane how much faster we're able to get to at least hypothesis and then test those hypotheses against because of tools like you talked about with Snowflake, which is awesome. I, I'm sitting here listening. I'm living this world, but now I'm an operator. I'm an operator listening to this call. What does this mean to me? Talk to me a little bit about what Signal Flare can do for an operator. Why do they care? What does it matter? Why is it that you exist? And if people aren't using your tool, compel me to understand not just the bits and bytes, but what does this actually do for an impact to the business?
Thanks for asking that question because I think also, look, I've been an operator. I've been working with the industry and operators and even franchisees for a really long time. So I get that people don't really care about what's under the hood. Some people do. I think
Hmm.
it's really important that what we do works, and anybody from anywhere can look under who has who understands the statistics and the machine learning and all that will stand up to anybody else's algorithms. But sometimes it's the most sophisticated things underneath. That's what's required to get the most simple and easy to use results at the end. And what I know about the folks in our industry is that they need to focus on their industry, and they just want to know what to do and how it's going to affect their business. And that's the difference between what we are, which is decision intelligence,
Hmm.
and a data company, right? A data company is just stacking up visualizations, right? And graphs and saying, you take it from here. We've got data for people who want to access data, but really our goal is to bring it right through to that last mile and
Okay.
say, look, if you do this as opposed to that, then the impact on your check average is going to be this. The impact on your traffic counts are going to be that, right? The impact on your promotions are going to be that, right? So that's really our true north, is saying, how do we really help you make a decision? And how do we make sure that our algorithms are constantly learning so that once you know what that decision is and you implement, that we're constantly going back to make sure that the simulators are getting better. So we're building everything in that last mile into probabilistic simulators where you can actually input. We'll make a recommendation, right, and
Hmm.
say this is what the optimal solution is. But what I know from working with restaurateurs is that they're not going to do what I tell them to do, right? They're going to do their own thing.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But they need to know what the consequences are going to be. They may be willing to take more risk than what I think they should take. But what's that going to do to your potential? What's that going to do to your check average, right?
What's it going to do
You
to your
might.
traffic and all of the things that you talked about? I guess breaking it down simply, you're going to tell them whether the cheeseburger should be $11 or should be $12.50, and they can then choose. Oh, I want it to be 11.75 based on your data and based on. And is it store by store? Is it store plus? Talk to me a little bit about how granular you get down to that. And do I have to be a 1,000 store chain in order to exercise these things? Because I think that's, you talked about your McDonald's days. A lot of people go, "Oh, that's great for McDonald's and Pizza Hut," but I'm not McDonald's and Pizza Hut. I own 30 stores, and I need to figure this out.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different models, right? So I think with the largest chains, we're a full white glove service, right? Where we've got consultants and analysts who are also helping them with special one-off questions as well, right? Where we're doing risk models and telling them what the price is of every menu item on or off menu, what what store should be priced and how to manage their pricing tiers and so forth. We also have completely the other extreme, which is I think our smallest customer has 8 units,
Okay.
and they're not really looking for item level pricing, but they want to understand how much each store can take, and they want to know what their competitors are priced, right? So at that level, we're able to say, look, in your market, because here's how things are priced, this store has the ability to take about 2.5%. This one can take 5%. This one has no room at all, right? You've got to you got to hold that one steady. And here's how your prices are priced versus your competitive items, right? For that level, very cost effective way for them to be able to say, we'll take it from here
Hmm.
and do our own item level pricing now that we've got the guidance that tells us how much price we can take. You know, with those same level, if they do want to pay a little bit extra, our analysts can help them do the final pricing as well.
Yeah, I love that explanation. It's so simple, and I think back to what kind of you've been trying to solve for so many years. It's just that idea. I'm going to go slightly controversial, Mike, and I'm going to talk about dynamic pricing, surge pricing, all of these different words that are out there. And I'm somewhat teasing. And for those that are on video, they watch Mike smile at me. But at the end of the day, we talked a little bit about the emotional attachment to restaurants. If I'm at a concert and I'm in an Uber and I need to get home and there's less Uber drivers, I get surge pricing. In restaurants, taking surge pricing and or discounted pricing, we've been doing discounted pricing for happy hour for as long as I've been alive and as long as you've been alive, likely. Just that's just how it's been for discounted pricing, but at the same time, surge pricing. Talk to me a little bit about why the word dynamic or surge pricing really doesn't work for restaurants. And I think when I say controversial, because there was a whole bunch of hubbub in the last few months where some large burger brand across the country was talking about doing surge pricing is how the article got written. And I think it's wrong. And I think you would agree that's not correct, a correct way to consider it.
Yeah, I get a little sticky about semantics. I think that it's crazy about the English language. We got a word for everything.
That's funny.
To your point, we've had happy hour forever, right? I wrote an article about, okay, going back, when did differential pricing start? And I think the first blue plate special that
Yeah.
was reported goes back to the 1880s. There's nothing new about pricing things differently by meal period, by day. There's nothing different about creating automated discounts, right?
Hmm.
We've been calling that marketing automation for 20 years. That's been happening as well. Dynamic has a specific meaning too, right? Which means constantly changing.
Uh-huh.
Now, this idea now that like differential pricing has morphed into dynamic pricing is just it's incorrect. So it irks me a little bit.
Me as
but I
well.
feel like
I mean,
I'm swimming against the
consumers
tide.
flipped out about it too on social media. I'm not going to go in and get a burger and it's $10 today and it's $11 tomorrow because they just happen to be busier. That nobody would accept that, at least in the food service industry thus far. They may accept it as time is going on. It went from $10 to 10.50 to $11, but they're not going to accept Tuesday it's one price and Wednesday it's a different price. If I'm interacting with that brand in a different way on a regular basis, it should stay pretty static. And so dynamic, I agree with you. The whole idea of dynamic pricing is I don't say a myth, but I don't think it's feasible and I don't think consumers will stand for it.
There's a better way to think about it and to look at it. And I've done work on some other technologies in the background on displays and so forth. If you take the idea of dynamic, and if, look, I think going back in 2017, I actually did a price and I did a presentation at one of the conferences talking about, look, dynamic pricing is coming, but what I described as dynamic pricing is much different than what it's become, right? Because what I was saying is, look, when dynamic pricing comes, as at least in what I anticipated it being, was being starting with a baseline of solid econometrics
Hmm.
and then thinking of the total spend as being the price, right? Not this ticker tape, the item price is changing in real time, or item prices changing during the peak. How do you change the bundle, right? Or how do you incentivize people to gravitate toward the higher priced items, right?
Hmm.
Or to how do you merchandise things, right? Because if you think about the opportunity in what the technologies are, this makes a lot more sense, right? Working with a lot of the large QSRs over time, I know that you can change, if you change an item price by 5%, you're going to get, if you change all your item prices by 5%, you're going to get 5% lift, right? But if you take a particular bundle and put it into the center panel, you can raise your check average by 25, 30%.
Hmm.
That's an opportunity, not just because you just increased your check average, but also because you did it with people opting into something that they want more,
Yeah,
right?
they found more value in whatever that item is that you were presenting them with.
And because you might be able to do it while you're managing other KPIs, right? Because maybe you chose that item because it's a higher throughput item, right?
Hmm.
Maybe
Yeah, it's
you
faster
chose
in
it
the
because
kitchen.
it's
It's lower food cost. Yeah, those are so many different factors, like you talked about, that might make you want to drive that.
so if there's a dynamic discussion that needs to be had in the industry right now, it should be about total dynamic menu management, right? Not just dynamic pricing. And look, I've spent so much of my life in teaching people about pricing.
Uh
So
huh.
you'd think that and look, we can easily help pipe pricing buckets, and we integrate into POS systems, helping to support dynamic pricing for anybody who decides that they like it. That's not a difficult thing for us to do. But I feel like it's a much bigger service to the industry to go the next step and actually do something that's going to take us to a higher level and offer, when you create something that's offering value to the customer while you're actually improving the service and the metrics, right? That's the kind of thing that the industry really needs. At
Yeah.
least that's my opinion.
And I've been calling it, I think you would agree based on our conversation today, it's data driven pricing decisions that you're making. It's based on, you're making conscious decisions based on the data and what is coming in, as well as, and the data doesn't necessarily have to be ones and zeros in the computer. It can be other data that you guys are capturing. Mike, how do people learn more? How do people engage? I'm sitting here, I'm 40 some minutes into listening to the show, and I'm like, I need to know more about this. How do I learn more about Signal Flare? How do I get engaged? How do I start to figure out if this is right for my brand and engage with your team to see what you guys might be able to do for them?
You can come to our website, SignalFlare.AI. You can email me, Mike at SignalFlare.AI. You can email Tammy, and you don't even need to know her email. You can just look at any conference website. She's
Yeah.
everywhere.
She is.
She
She's
is.
a big deal, that Tammy lady. So,
That's
well,
right.
I'm grateful that I know we were teasing about it because I've known about you for quite some time and I've heard all these fantastic things. And while I teased Tammy about it, she was 100% right. You're very wise in this area of pricing and price elasticity. And again, I guess I would ask you to give me one last encouragement for brands that aren't down this path. Like, what are they going to miss out on if they haven't already started down this path of working with you guys or somebody else to evaluate these data elements? And they're still sitting there going, I see a menu. I think people are going to pay 18.95 for chicken parmesan, so I'm just going to put 18.95 on that. Whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, again, I'm just picking a random item. What are they going to miss if they haven't already gone down this path?
I think there's a few different levels to it. So one is that, look, in decades now of using a more sophisticated way of pricing, there's a very high return on investment to it. And look, we've gone through the scrutiny of every major brand with test and control and all of that. And it's proven that when you use these kinds of methodologies, and the one that we're using now is even more effective than the ones that I've used in the past. And you're
Awesome.
getting at least double the flow through of doing it on your own. So there's that, just the pure ROI on it. Now, what I'm building though is not just a pricing engine. We are doing this because we are the first decision intelligence company in the restaurant industry. So all of this data that we're ingesting and creating for these pricing models is really the foundation of understanding what makes your demand tick. So as we're building the pricing models, we're starting to understand what's driving your marketing, what's driving your promotions, where are your customers coming from? And all of this is driven by, not to jump on a buzzword, it's all machine learning algorithms underneath.
Yep.
And that means that the longer you do it, the smarter they get. Once you adopt these types of technologies, they get smarter, right? So you get on it now and you continue with it. What you know and what you can do and what you can automate is going to be much better a year from now than it is today. So the
Mhm.
longer you wait, you start to slip behind. And you can see these kind of case studies in industries across the board where the ones that waited, too long find themselves way behind.
Yeah, no, and I say it all the time. If you're not doing it, likely your competitor's doing it. And so you better watch out because they're going to figure out how to win the game because they've invested in tools like what you guys are building. So, Mike, thank you for educating us. Thank you for even wading into the discomfort as I threw out some of those buzzwords. It's fun to finally meet on the show. I'll have to thank Tammy after the fact for introducing us, and I'm excited to have our listeners out there learn more about you guys. To our listeners, guys, we know you guys have got lots of choices, as I said. So thank you guys for spending time with us. And to Mike, thank you. And to our listeners, make it a great day.